All right, so I'm going to choose a particular data model, and I'm going to create a RESTful service that I can expose that data model and then be able to access it from a React client, just to give you a sense on what it is that you're going to be working on this sprint. Let's see. Let's go in here, and let's create a couple the data model that we're going to be using for. Just for illustration purposes. Notice that I have most of the data models for you, the ones that you're going to be working on throughout the sprint. I'm going to create a brand new data model, right? One that we haven't assigned to anyone, right? Because it's one of the most boring ones. The quotes, being able to have a service provider provide a quote for a client that they want some service, right? For instance, they've asked, hey, can you come and clean my house every Friday, right, from in the Friday afternoons? And the quote might be, sure, I'll come in and clean it for $200 or whatever, right? I'll come in and clean your house. So that quote needs to be listed somewhere, right? We need a record to keep track of what is that I'm going to do and how much I'm going to charge you. Right? So let's create a little simple data model to capture that. All right, so let's do that. So I'll create a Java class here, and I'll call it quote. And that quote is going to have fields such as integer, the ID. It's going to have, let's see what else. It's going to have maybe the job description, and maybe how much I'm going to charge you, and price. All right. Now, typically what I want to be able to do is be able to map this to a relational database. And to do that, we're going to annotate this as an entity, as a JPA entity. And the default behavior is that why can't you resolve this? JPA. Close all. Quote. Let me refresh this. Refresh. And let me update the Maven project. All right, there it is. Import. Okay, so to be able to map this this Java data model to a relational data model, we can use the entity annotation, and by default, it'll map this class to a table of the same name, right? But it'll be all lowercase. We can override the name of that table by annotating it with the table annotation, and giving it the actual name that we want it to use. In this case, we're going to use the plural quotes because there's going to be lots of records stored in there. And we can then annotate and keep annotating this to say that this ID field is going to be our primary key mapped to the primary key in the database. Right? So we're going to annotate it with ID. And we're also going to say that we don't want to have to deal with creating these IDs ourselves on the application. Instead, we're going to delegate it to a database and say, you figure it out. You choose. You generate these values on the server. Using whatever strategy we want to use. In this case, we're going to use a strategy called the identity strategy, which basically databases will just use a counter or a sequence, right, that will go from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth, right? And it'll be, in particular, in MySQL, will be implemented as an auto increment, or in SQL Server, it will be implemented as an identity. Okay. What else? We also need to have this. Follow the Java bean naming convention. So we'll need setters and getters for this. So let's select all that, and that's going to generate it. There we go. Let's restart this and see. Let's see. Do we already have that table? Database refresh. Okay, we don't have the table here. So let's refresh and restart the server and see. Make sure that this maps correctly to JPA. And that the table is created. Indeed, here's the table being created. right? And if we refresh the table, the database, we see that the table indeed has been created, and we can create a couple of dummy. Well, we'll leave it for later. We'll do it later. All right, so I think we're done with that particular entity. Any questions? All right, this is what you might have been working in the previous sprints. Yes. All right, so let's put this in source control. Okay, so I'm working in master. I shouldn't be working in master. Right, so make sure, even though the tasks in the assignment don't say anything about source control, right? That means that it doesn't mean that you're not going to follow good source control management. Right? We still, the TAs are still going to look for making sure that you are working in your independent feature branches, that you are using you're creating pull requests, and you have someone else merge something for you. Right? You should never be merging something on your own. So anyway, so I'm going to create a branch here. This is section 3. And git status. So I'm going to say git add, git commit, and added quote entity. There we go. All right, so we have that. Let's now create the repository that will allow us to communicate with this data model with the database. So in the repositories, we'll create a real quick a repository. So we'll call it quote repository. And it's not really a class; it's an interface. So this interface is going to give us functions such as things such as give me all the quotes. So find all quotes. And we would like to be able to also retrieve an individual quote if we know the ID. Okay? All right, so to do this, we can extend the CRUD repository, which allows us to create, read, update, and delete whatever we want here. For in this case, the quote, we want to CRUD quote instances, and we need the primary key here, which is an integer. All right, that's it. This would allow us to interact. Although we need to configure what are the actual queries, the database queries that we want to use to retrieve all these quotes. What are these SQL queries? To do that, we're going to use the query annotation and say, well, for that particular function, this is the SQL query that I want you to use. So for finding all quotes, it'll be select quotes from quote. Okay. Notice that this is not straight SQL. It's actually a higher level version of SQL. It's an object-oriented SQL, right? Where this is the name of the class, right? And this is some instance of that class. So I'm selecting all the instances that are of type quote, basically. Right? To find a quote by ID, we just add here a where the ID of that quote is equal to some placeholder, which we need to map to this particular integer that we're passing as a parameter. So to map that, we use another annotation. We annotate the parameter, right, and we give it the name. We're saying we are annotating. We're saying that this ID parameter here, this placeholder, we're going to grab it from this integer parameter that's being fed into the function. Yes? All right. All right. I think we're done with the repository. Let's add that. We'll say git add, git commit, added quote repository. Right. So also please be as verbose or something like this, where you reach a level of confidence or a level of stability on a particular file that you're working on. Commit often. Right. Keep track of all your work, and whenever you reach a nice stable stage of your coding, right? That's not broken, that it compiles, that it's okay. You're committed, so that you can always backtrack to, if you paint yourself in a corner, you can always backtrack to a previous point where you can unblock yourself. All right, so let's see. So we have the repository now. Now let's create the RESTful service that can expose our data model through a RESTful web service. Let's see. So we'll say quote service, and we'll implement the service. Basically, we want to be able to expose the data that we have there. Now the repository plays the role of an interface between two worlds, right? The Java object world and the flat relational world, right? It allows that interface between those two, those two worlds. This quote service is going to play a similar role between two worlds, right? The stream world of the HTTP network world and the Java world, right? Communicating between these two worlds, right? Same API. We want to be able to retrieve a list of quotes. So find all quotes, or retrieve a particular quote. Find quote by ID, taking integer ID as an argument, and we're going to retrieve that from the repository that we just created, the quote repository. Oops, quote repository, which is the repository. And the way we're gonna get a hold of this is by injecting it here. We're gonna ask the framework to please instantiate it for us and inject it. Right, so some inversion of control here. And then we can use it internally to implement these functions, right? We can say I'm going to return the repository dot find all quotes, and this will be return repository find by ID, and then the ID. All right. Now, this service works well inside our Java world, maybe used by other Java classes, right? This might be a service, perhaps, a service layer. But we want to expose this to the environment, right? For other folks to be able to use these functions, right? We don't want to just use it within our Java class. We want to expose it everywhere else. So to do that, we're going to use a REST controller, which is going to create a controller out of this, right? So that it'll be available through the HTTP protocol, right? And we can then map these to specific requests that might come in through the server. We might say, well, if an incoming URL comes in following this pattern, then I want you to execute this function, right? And retrieve and return whatever that repository retrieves, right? And do all the conversions that you need to convert it from the Java world to the HTTP streaming world, right? And in particular, using a format that is friendly to consumers, right? To JavaScript consumers. In this case, the default being JSON representation, right? So similarly, we want to be able to retrieve a particular quote if we know the ID of that quote, right? Now, what we want to be able to do is map this quote ID that is embedded in the path. We want to map it to this integer. So to do that, we can do a path variable, and then map it to that quote ID. That's going to parse it from the path, and then bind it to this parameter so that we can use it in the function. All right, so let's restart this, see if it blows up, and see if we can expose some data here. All right, so we should be able to try and hit that server at 8080, and it was, I think, API quotes. All right, so that's promising. It's showing an empty array, probably because we don't have any actual records in the database. So let's insert a couple of dummy records in there. So there's quote, and here let's I need to, I want to clean my house, maybe walk my dogs, right? And house $200, yeah, $50. Right, so that has been added to the database. If we go back to the RESTful service and we refresh, we'll see that indeed we have access to that data through an HTTP GET. All right, right. So this was the focus of last week, right? And if you didn't finish it, that's fine. Just carry it over. Use any of the examples that I'm giving you, right, to finish that off, so that we can now focus on the client side, right? All right. So let's focus on the client side and implement a couple of. Let's create a small React application that can consume this data and render it on a browser. All right, so let's do that next.